You know, I'm going to give you a history lesson.
We got some dumbass motherfuckers floating around this country.
Stop laughing! And when I do, start.
Also, y'all did some nasty-ass jokes on my ass, too.
Funny jokes and unfunny jokes come out of the same birth.
You f***ing guys are unbelievable.
Why are you laughing?
Evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Why Are You Laughing, a history of comedy podcast. And today, I am pleased to introduce to you the top 10 comedians that should have had a podcast. Kind of a confusing title, but basically what I'm saying is every comedian on the planet Earth right now has a podcast, or so it seems. But I thought of 10 that actually would have benefited from a podcast, probably. Maybe older people where it wasn't around, but that really would have been their thing. We've talked about a guy who's not on the list that we talked about was Robert Schimmel, where I was like, he's a little more obscure. He didn't have the fame of some of his peers that he was just as talented as, I think. But if he came up in the era of podcasting, I think he would have found a much bigger audience. So we're talking about guys like that, or people that just naturally fit into having a podcast and never did for whatever reason. I'll explain my reasoning as we go along, and you guys can let me know if you agree, if you feel the same way, or if I missed any names. Let me know in the comments, because I was listening to I was actually listening to an old clip of Rogan and Colin Quinn, I think, talking about getting Norm on the Joe Rogan Experience, and this is like before he died. They were talking, and it just never happened. And I was like, oh, would that have been a great episode?
Would have been unbelievable.
So I guess basically I'm thinking of comedians where, wow, it would have been great to have more of them, just a back catalog. Because now, whoever you like now, pretty much, whoever your favorite comedian is, whether it's Shane Gillis or Tim Dillon or Andrew Schultz or Mark Normand or whoever, there's even people that don't do podcasts like John Mulaney, there's hours and hours of content of them talking and doing comedy, and all their stuff pretty much is out there. There's few exceptions, like Dave Attell, then guys that kind of seclude themselves. But for the most part, you have plenty of whoever your favorite comedians are, but that has not always been the case. So that's what we're examining today. And a quick Why Are You Laughing announcement. Craig doesn't even know this. People are going to be shocked. For the next few weeks, maybe a couple months, all Why Are You Laughing content will be exclusive for members. That is mainly because, I don't know if you guys have noticed lately, but our schedule's been a little weird, and it's prohibited me from doing kind of the same deep dives we've been doing. Like you might have noticed, we've done a couple albums, and even an episode like this is not the typical deep dive into one subject that we do. And that's because our schedule has been a little weird. So I want a little more time to do some of the more biographical episodes. Like, for example, I want to do Cosby soon. That's one I definitely want to do.
Yeah.
and that'll take a little more time than just John Mulaney's album or something.
It'd be fun if we just never talk about his allegations.
Well, that's, we'll see. We'll see if we have time to get there. The man had a long career.
That's right.
But yeah, so I want to do deeper dives like that. And I have a project I'm working on. Let's just say a long list of comedians that will take some extra time. So we'll be doing that in June and July. So all Why Are You Laughing episodes will be up for Patreon and YouTube members. And then eventually some of them will be released as regular episodes. So if you can wait, just wait till the end of the summer and you'll get them. But for the most part, if you want them early, make sure you become a Patreon or YouTube member. So it's kind of a break, but not really, because you can get all the content on Patreon or YouTube members. But if you're a freeloader out there, then consider becoming a member. It's just $5 a month. It's nothing if you like the program. So if that's worth it to you, hop on board. And then for the rest of you, we'll be back in a few weeks on our regular schedule. And I think that'll be worth it. I think the episodes will be, hopefully you'll see that there's some work put into them. So
it's the summertime, people. Don't you understand?
Yeah, exactly. So make sure you check that out. Blindmike.net is where you can find all those links. If you want to support the show, like I said, particularly by becoming a member, all those links are there. And it might also allow us to do extra Blind Mike projects over the next few weeks. So if you've never checked out the Blind Mike project, make sure you do so. And I would also say over the next couple weeks, go back through the archives, because some of the, I noticed typically the older people we cover, Fred Willard, Bob Newhart, Freddie Prinz, or even some of the topics that seem maybe a little more boring, like Louis Anderson, Tim Allen, Bob Saget. They're not names you necessarily like, oh, I gotta watch. And those are, to me, a lot of the more interesting episodes. So consider checking those out. Any episode you haven't checked out yet, we've got like 130 episodes in the archives. So make sure you go back through those.
Yeah, if you go to the early episodes, it'll seem a lot different.
Oh, yeah. Well,
different faces.
We figured it out, Got rid of some of the riffraff.
That's right.
So yeah, go back to the archives, check that out, and like I said, consider becoming a member, because that's where you'll be getting the episodes for the next few weeks. And then, like I said, some of those will be free, so don't feel like you have to do it, but consider it. Blindmike.net is where you get all those links. All right. So, I thought this was an interesting topic today because we do a podcast. I'm very interested in podcasts. And like I said, these are names where it would have been great just to have more of them. And I think the medium is beneficial to these people. Like, I think they would have really thrived in this environment. Like that would have been the perfect, where people that came up in, I mean, really any era before 2010, more or less, you either had to be a TV star or a movie star. And some comics, like, they're just so weird that doesn't fit them. And also, back in the day, there's only 3 TV channels, There aren't as many places for you to go find a comedian. So it's more difficult for them to get their name out there if they're weird, if they're not the conventional vaudeville comic from back in the day. So we cover a few names that I think fit this bill correctly. But like I said, leave in the comments any that I missed or any that you think would be great. But let's start here. Who are we starting with?
We're starting with Andy Kaufman.
So Andy Kaufman is a guy that I said, and it's tough to even consider him a stand-up, but I do for this reason. I consider him the godfather of alt comedy. We did an episode about him where if you look at what he was doing on stage, just reading books and taking naps and weird shit like that, that blew the doors open for what is now known as alt comedy. You look at even a guy like Rick Glassman, who's doing very weird things with his podcast that I like. That's a lot of that is because of someone like Andy Kaufman. So Andy Kaufman, like, I not necessarily even considered a stand-up because he was so weird, but I think could have done something very interesting with a podcast. So let's play a clip. This is from a talk show that he did, where, again, he was doing things that now may be a little more commonplace, but at the time it was bizarre, and you didn't even really know what you were watching.
I have all these questions. Bums, you're supposed to talk about the bums in New York City. Then you talk about shrinks, how you went to a shrink because you were the only person you knew who would go up to a bum and ask them if they need money. And then...
this is him, by the way, with Elaine Boozler, his ex-girlfriend. They're having an argument here.
Don't talk about shrinks because comedians, those are one of the subjects of comedians don't talk about. And then no-nos in comedy, that's shrinks leading to death. Death is another no-no in comedy. Who's the best comedian at death? The guy you went to the Catskills with. Then you talk about the Catskills, the whole thing in the Catskills. Then you talk about the cake and the train. Then you talk about you opened with Catskills.
You opened with the Catskills.
Then comedians. Then talk about the time I flipped out at Channel 5 in New York, and they had to take me away with the security guards and the whole Bill Boggs episode.
Do I have a list of paper in front of me? You have a whole list of subjects.
Right, so why didn't you just wait? I led you into the
anything?
New York City. I said, "What have you been to New York City lately? Have you?" And you changed the subject.
I did not change the subject.
Yes, you did. You changed the subject. I'm sitting here trying to lead you into New York City. I'm sitting here not trying to lead you into New York City. I'm trying to lead you into the sub. Okay, we're back. And thank you.
Like, and we played that clip in full in the Andy Kaufman episode, and it's just a great moment where, again, now I think comedy fans in particular are more just astute and aware of what's going on in comedy. But if you just stumbled upon that on, I forget what channel it was on, but CBS or whatever it was in the 70s, you're just like, what the fuck is this? Are they having a real argument? They don't know they're on camera right now? What's going on? You think it's wild. And so Andy Kaufman pushing those boundaries, I think he would have found something very unique and weird to do with the podcast. He also feels like a guy that would have started a few podcasts and they would have lasted 6 episodes. So maybe he doesn't fit perfectly into what I'm talking about. But but he does seem like he would have been. And you just see like how good an actor he was in that moment where someone yells 5 seconds and he kind of stops himself and is like, oh, fuck. He has to like ready himself. Like that's how good an actor he was.
Amazing.
So really brilliantly done. And he did it like he did a lot of weird shit. Like his he's mocking talk shows by having his desk 15 feet higher than the guest. So like he was very creative and clever. And I think on a podcast, he could have done something very unique and weird rather than just having other, his peers on for kind of generic interviews about their career. I think he would have found stuff to do like that. And like I said, a guy like Rick Glassman is doing that now where he's doing, strange that I like it, but a lot of visual stuff and a lot of bits on his podcast that you're not seeing everywhere else. And that's the kind of stuff that Andy Kaufman opened the door for. So that's our number 10 is Andy Kaufman. I think I was between, at number 10, I was between him and Lenny Bruce. Bruce almost felt like a cliche answer because, he opened the doors for what is modern stand-up. But the reason I went Andy Kaufman over Lenny Bruce is because while Lenny Bruce was the first to kind of create a more honest format in comedy, there's now 100, 1,000 people doing the type of podcast Lenny Bruce would probably be doing,
Mm-hmm.
Like he would probably be doing something similar to what Rogan is doing, where he just wants to have that kind of conversation with people. Whereas I think Andy Kaufman would be weird and more unique. So that's why he made it in at number 10.
Number 9, I fully support this one as Ron White.
Yeah, Ron White is a guy. He is in the era of podcasting and probably, maybe the richest guy on our list. Certainly the only one with a plane. So, like, financially, maybe the most successful guy on our list. But a guy that never did a podcast. And when I hear him on other podcasts and even through his stand-up, he's just got such a nice way of talking where you could listen to him talk about anything. So I think our first clip is kind of examining the honesty that he doles out, right? It's him talking about Dane Cook.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's hear this.
My best comedy album story, and I don't mean this to be mean or anything else, but it was.
Yes, you do.
I was watching the record sales because my records was selling. And then Dane Cook comes in and he just blows by me. And I'm like, who's this guy? Because I'm not an LA guy. I'm a road guy. We don't know what's going on out here, nor do we give a shit. And but I thought, well, it must be. So I was at a bookstore and I saw it. And I thought, well, I'm gonna buy it and see what it's like. So literally I'll listen to it on the way home. When I got home, I pulled it out, threw it in the trash. Not to be mean, but just because I don't keep things I don't use. Right. And I knew I wouldn't listen to it again, and I wasn't going to give it to somebody else to listen to. And so I don't need it anymore. It's we've run our thing, and not to say anything bad about Dane, because plenty of bad things have been said, but but I was so uninto it that if that's what they're doing out there, then they're getting away with murder because those aren't punchlines. I'm sorry to tell you.
Well, Ron White, to me, because he was part of the blue collar crew, kind of has this stigma to him that he's like a hack cornball or something.
Well, I was gonna say it's crazy. Like if you just think back how big that was and how much he did not fit in.
Not at all. Yeah, he has a Southern accent, so I guess that's why he fit in. And like Jeff Foxworthy, I think did do a lot for like Southern comedy, and I get that he's respected and everything. But to me, Ron White, if you're looking at pure stand-ups, is leagues above everyone else in that crew. And, Larry the Cable Guy is doing a character, and that I can respect and everything. I'm really more saying that the idea that him and Bill Engvall shared a stage is just an insult to Ron White.
It's an insult to comedy.
Yeah, to everyone. It's an insult to you and me, and everybody.
Ron White is legitimately in my top 10. I find him so funny.
Yeah, and so I think he's a tremendous storyteller, and he just has he lights a cigar. He doesn't drink anymore, but the idea that he lights a cigar, has a drink, and will just tell you stories, and will be brutally honest. And you hear him; he's got that nice Southern charm to him, where he's like, man, I don't want to be mean, but just completely insult. But Dane Cook isn't doing comedy. I don't want to be mean, but I'm going to destroy this guy's entire being.
Cook his best-selling album. I threw it in the trash.
Yeah, so I think he's just got that matter-of-fact style, and he's a great storyteller, and could have been a somewhat different perspective than you get on podcasts, and a little more honest. Like if he just had a podcast where he was talking about whatever he wanted, but would sometimes weigh in on certain things in the state of comedy, I think you'd get a type of honesty that you don't always get from comics at his level. So I think Ron White fits this bill as well. I would have liked a little more Ron, and he's good on podcasts, so I would have liked a little more Ron White.
Well, here is a little more Ron White.
Oh yeah, so this is Theo Vaughn kind of perfectly encapsulating what I'm saying about the charm of Ron White.
It's interesting. I'm trying to think of what it is. I've seen you a bunch of times at the Comedy Store. Yeah, I mean, I've seen your stuff over the years. I'm trying to think of, being able to be closer to you now and see you at the Comedy Store, what it is. Definitely the pace kind of, there's like a comfortable hypnosis kind of that goes on a little bit. Also, I feel like as a viewer, I want to get to know, I don't care about, I love the jokes and material's great, but I want to get to see Ron White. I want to get to see him just be him. And there's something that's different than some other artists. You go to hear their jokes, it's like, oh, they'll have a great bit or something. But with you, I feel like, man, it is weird. It's almost like, yeah, polar bear, you want to see them. They're kind of a, not an endangered species, but they're you don't get to see them everywhere.
Right. Yeah, I really don't know. It's it just like I said, I've seen people better at it than me.
Yeah.
And, that didn't get what I've been given as as an entertainer, and so, and I try to be humble and accept it, and and I've never been arrogant about my skills as a comedian.
Yeah.
Although I know I'm really good at something, right? Because it did happen,
That's true.
I think Theo Vaughn just nails it, because there is a comfort. Now, there's also something to be said. This is where the entire premise of this episode is kind of hypocritical in and of itself, because there's also something to be said for the fact that Ron White was able to build that comfort with his audience and build a persona where you want to see more of him without having to see more of him.
I thought it was like a perfect analogy, being like, you like to go see a polar bear, and like other people, you just want to hear jokes, but like people want to see you.
Yeah, like, oh wow, that's Ron White. Look at him, he's drinking and having a cigar, just like the TV says.
It's crazy though, because like a lot of people will go to clubs, and like the same few clubs in New York or whatever, build and everything. He legitimately just was traveling until he became gigantic.
Yeah, and like I said, there's something to be said for less is more. Like there are guys that purposely aren't on this list who I love. Like I'm so glad Brian Regan has never done a podcast, because and the stories you always hear of Brian Regan is like, you get a few drinks in him, he's not quite the squeaky clean guy. he works blue off stage, from what they say.
Yeah, I enjoy hearing him on other people's podcasts once in a while.
Once in a while, yeah, but you don't want too much of him, because it kind of ruins the Brian Regan character. Like we might have the perfect amount of Brian Regan. I think David Tell's another guy like that, where even him on podcasts might be too much, where I just want to see his act because it's so mysterious. I don't want to know more about him.
David Tell is one of the few, he's one of my favorite comics, and I think he, in terms of comics on podcasts, I would put in almost in the terrible bucket. Like I don't enjoy him on podcasts.
It's not the same appeal. And I've heard like Rogan and guys like that say like Attell would do a great podcast. Maybe he would if he put a lot of effort into it, but I don't know that I want more of him because it's not what he's best at. Whereas what Ron White I think is best at is storytelling, and that's where podcasting lends itself to his talent, I think. But like I said, it's hypocritical in nature what we're doing, because a lot of these people are as big as they are because they had the perfect amount of them out there.
Yeah. But like when you said Regan, I always think of him and Gaffigan almost because they're similar styles.
And you know, another guy I don't have on the list is Hedberg, because I look at Mark Norman, who I love from podcasts, but I think podcasting has almost ruined his stand-up. Where, like, just the one example I'll use, I think there's a bunch of examples like this, but there's a line in his special. It's just a tag on a joke. He's talking about the gay pride flag, and he says, "God hates flags." And I've heard him use it's a funny line. I have heard him say that probably 700 times. No joke. Because he's on so many podcasts, and that topic might just happen to come up, and he throws it out there as a, you know, it's the same as him going comedy. Like, he just has this autistic little, let me toss this line in. So that when I heard it in his special, I was kind of like, oh, he's doing that on there? It almost takes away from his stand-up. So I think like a lot of those one-liner guys like Hedberg and Stephen Wright, it actually would have taken away from the magic that they're doing by them doing a podcast.
If Hedberg did a podcast, it would be like if Howard Stern fell asleep instead of Artie.
I guess so, yeah.
The host falling asleep in his chair. But next, we have Rodney.
So this is actually kind of goes against what I'm saying, because Rodney's known as a joke writing guy. But Rodney's a guy that I would have loved to have more of, because I think in a great way, his offstage persona is so different than... I'm being a hypocrite because I just said the opposite about Brian Regan. But I think Rodney has such amazing stories. And Norm, we're about to hear from Norm, but he would talk about going to see Rodney, you know, not made for TV. And you're like, whoa, this is a different... Holy shit. This is a different guy. Like, he's working completely blue. He's the same Rodney, but he's darker. When he's not, you know, preparing for the Tonight Show or something. So that side of Rodney, I think I would have been interested in, which makes Rodney Dangerfield number 8 on our list here. And this is Norm on Howard Stern telling a story about Rodney.
I met Rodney, man, when I made the worst mistake ever, which I was in the fucking hotel, and I loved Rodney and shit. I didn't know him. And I was coming down in the casino. I was coming down the fucking elevator, and Rodney was in the elevator. I'm like, oh my God, it's Rodney. I gotta say something to him. So anyways, I'd worked on some stupid fucking thing with this director who said he worked with Rodney. So I used that as a thing, right? So I go, hey, Rodney. I go, we have a common friend. He goes, who's that? I go, you know, Paul Johnson. He goes, that cocksucker. No friend, and it was a full elevator. That fucker's no friend of mine. You tell him he can suck my dick. I'm like, oh, I'm not his friend. I'm not his friend.
You know, you hear the stories that Rodney was sort of a bitter guy because he made it late in life and all that, but yet he was a sweet guy because
he helped everybody.
I mean, he did.
So I don't know. Maybe it's like I was just talking about with Norman, where less is more. You get to see the great joke writing, and you don't have to see maybe the depressing nature of what Rodney would have been on a podcast. But I feel like some of that bitterness and the great stories that he would have had, because he just stopped giving a fuck at the end of his life. You know, people talk about like they would go see Rodney and he'd be smoking weed with just his robe open and his balls hanging out. Like, he stopped caring about anything, which I think can be an interesting element on a podcast. Again, maybe I'm reading it wrong, and it would have been disastrous and completely killed the guy in the rumpled suit that we see on the Tonight Show. It would have killed that image. But I think he has some stories to tell that would have been interesting.
I was going to say, I'm going to preface this. I'm not comparing Bert Kreischer and Rodney Dangerfield, just for everyone.
Oh boy. All right.
You know, we've talked about how Bert will say things people won't on podcasts, but he's like goofy about it, kind of. Rodney would do the same thing, except he would be like that fucking cocksucker. Like,
I don't think Rodney would care about torching his career on a podcast.
Correct.
Which I kind of like. Whereas, like, a guy like Rickles, to me, doesn't make this list because he had more, like Normand, he had more kind of formatted jokes that he would insert in different. So I think if you go back and watch a lot of Rickles, you start to hear some of the kind of standard lines that he had. Whereas if he came up in the era of the internet, it might have taken away from the mystique of Rickles, because you realize like, oh, he has some of these ready to go.
Yeah, they're in the can.
Yeah, exactly. Where I think Rodney is a little different than your typical kind of one-liner guy.
Next, another excellent choice. We have Colin Quinn.
I mean, it's ironic because Colin Quinn hates podcasts, which we're about to hear. But I think he's a tremendous guest on podcasts and radio. I think he was one of Opie and Anthony's best. It always baffles me because I get things have been revealed about the Opie and Anthony show over the years, just through their feuds. And one thing that always stood out to me is that Jim Norton mentioned that Opie thought Colin Quinn was a bad guest on the show. And I was like, I find that to be so crazy to me.
And also very, yep, that makes sense.
It makes sense that it's Opie saying it, but it's so crazy to me because he might be my favorite. Like when I heard Colin was on, I was excited because he held them, and he did this when he was on Stern as well. Like he had bits with Eric the Midget. He wanted to rewrite Taxi Driver and have Eric the Midget star in it. So like he knew how to incorporate these side characters, and he would do that with Lady Di and Bobo on the Opie and Anthony show. Like I thought he was great at helping add to the podcast and some of the characters around it. Is our first clip him versus calling out Norton here for his Twitter thing?
Yeah.
So this is what he's great at, is just like calling out his buddies for their bullshit, and which is one of the reasons I think he would have been a great podcaster.
Speaking of dark places, Jim Norton unfollowed me on Twitter about a month and a half ago.
Oh.
Here's what I'm saying. First of all, whatever explanation he comes up with is going to be so distorted. Second of all, here's my theory. I'll just give you my theory.
Yeah.
This creep. First of all, who unfollows? What are we, high school kids? Second of all, my theory is it was two things. One's creepy than the next. One is he unfollowed me because I dared, after he asked his fans, who I was one of, and I'm still following him, if what we thought of JimNorton.com, and I gave an honest appraisal.
No.
And second of all, which is even worse, is that he's making a clean break. And just he follows you guys, Patrice, who, as we know, is no longer with us, obscure writer, and some girl. And it's the creepiest thing ever. And if he actually unfollowed me and the rest of his friends because he's making a clean break, and he's like, I'm just going to just follow a few people who really work pure and clean. It's nauseating.
Like for Colin to call in because he noticed Norton unfollowed him is great radio instincts. Like I think Colin has a lot of those instincts that guys like Howard Stern had. I'm not saying to that level, but like I think he knew what would make good radio or good podcasting a lot. Like he would there's a time where he lived like down the street from Opie and Anthony's studio, and I remember he marched over in his pajamas once because of the way Jim Norton promoted dice. And I guess they did some read for a club that had like Dice and Attell coming up, and Norton goes, man, these are all theater acts that you can get for a reasonable price. And Colin marched down in his pajamas to call him a hack. So I think he has great radio instincts, and also he I think he's just a brilliant guy. Like go watch his special Our Time Is Up, out now on YouTube. He did it in front of a symposium of therapists or psychologists, and it's like brilliant. Like his take on society is, again, we're talking something you could use more of. I think Colin Quinn's voice is something we could use more of. Like when I see a Colin Quinn clip on Instagram or YouTube, I'm like, oh, Colin is a guy. He might, now he's kind of a comics comic and isn't as mainstream popular as maybe some other guys that are not as funny as him. But Colin's a guy that's going to be like Carlin in the future, in the sense that both political parties are going to be playing his clips. Like, see, Colin got it, and they're both going to claim him, even though neither of them fully understand him.
Right. But here he is on KFC radio talking about how much he hates podcasts.
Yeah, so this is the irony of why he would be one of the great. It's probably what would make him one of the greatest podcasters, is his disdain for podcasting.
Because there's so many and it's so saturated like everything else that every conversation I'm like, did we have this conversation with you? Did you have somebody else that I have it with that person? It's like everybody's kind of like, you know, especially when you're all in the same industry.
Right.
And so now what I was telling my friends the other day, like, always want me to be on that stupid podcast. And then I go, okay, but then they go, so what's going, how was your week? I go, no. You want it to be podcast? I'm your podcast friend. No more personal relationship. You don't fucking ask me how I was. I'll save it for your podcast.
I think his awareness of why there are too many podcasts and why a lot of them suck is, again, what would make him a great podcaster. It's the cruel irony of this, you know? And, I think that would drive him to make a more interesting podcast than a lot of people are doing. And also, Colin Quinn is one of the godfathers of podcasting. If you think of who deserves credit for what podcasting is, I would comedy podcasting, anyways. I would say it's Howard Stern, Opie and Anthony, and Tough Crowd with Colin Quinn. Like, if you watch old Tough Crowd episodes, it's essentially a podcast where they're talking about current event topics and then going off into tangents where they're making fun of Rich Voss's hat or something. You know, like they kind of created the nature of what a lot of podcasts became. So Colin Quinn being at the forefront of that is why he would be, I think, one of the best at it.
Number 5 on the list, Greg Giraldo.
We're already at number 5? How is that possible?
Kaufman, Ron White, Rodney, Colin, Giraldo.
Wow. All right, we're cruising through these. Greg Giraldo is one of my favorite comedians, and again, a guy who I just want more of. So maybe he's selfishly on this list.
No, he would be great. He would be doing Part of the Problem way better than Dave Smith.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what made me think of it is when we did the Greg Giraldo episode, go back, over the next few weeks, make sure you go back and watch that if you haven't. Because that's one of my favorites. Because we played a clip of Jim Gaffigan talking about how basically Comedy Central was thinking of him like when Jon Stewart left, whenever that would be. At the time, they didn't know, obviously, when Giraldo died. But it was only a few years away that Giraldo would have been the perfect replacement for Jon Stewart. And they even tried to have Greg Giraldo replace Colin Quinn as the host of Tough Crowd, and Giraldo wouldn't do it. So those the reasons he would be great on those shows is the same reason I think he'd be a great podcaster. Not only, like you said, would be doing a political podcast that I think is very insightful, but also, as we're about to see here, another guy that's not afraid of confrontation and calling other comics out for their bullshit.
Well, or maybe there's a non-violent way to solve the whole North Korea thing.
Good thinking.
They're asking for, there might be. They're asking for what?
There's a nonviolent way to solve the problem with the country that we hate, that hates us, has got weapons pointed at us? I don't think so.
No, you're right. Like Russia, for example, that big Russian war.
So quick. And Dennis Leary is steaming.
This makes me hate Dennis Leary so much.
But that exchange right there, and we're about to hear more, but that exchange already, when he says, nah, I don't think so, and Giraldo immediately goes, yeah, like Russia, for example, that big Russian war. It feels scripted. It feels like he knew Dennis Leary was going to say that. It's so quick.
There are approaches. You have to be strong about it, but there are approaches. There are economic benefits that we're giving them in order for them to stop developing their weapons. I mean, I heard recently they agreed to stop building nukes if American women agree to get their nails done at least twice a week. It's just something I read.
That's a good point. This guy writes so many jokes before the show, it's not even funny. It's unbelievable. He's got a pocket full of them. Yeah. They're good ones. I'm not saying they're not good. I'm just saying.
Well, another, going back to someone else on our list here, good for Colin for calling him out, because he's aware. To maybe the people in the audience, it sounds almost like Dennis Leary's complimenting him. As a comic, Colin knows he's saying, oh, guys, these are all written.
Right.
And Colin's like, yeah, but they're good jokes, asshole. And Giraldo has a it much better response.
A TV show.
Yeah, right.
They're good ones.
I'm not saying they're not good. I'm just saying.
It was right there.
That's kind of what we do here, Dennis. I'm a comedy writer.
Oh, boy. I'm not coming back. You know what? You're the guy in school that did all the homework and then asked if there was any more that needed to be done.
Yeah. That's a good point. And if you had tried a little comedy writing, maybe your show would still be on the air.
That one wasn't written, Dennis.
Yeah, that's the thing is like the unwritten lines are so much better than the written lines.
He's gonna be TV clean.
It's stingingly quick.
Oh.
So yeah, I think Giraldo would have been a great podcaster and would have offered a perspective. Like he was a liberal guy. You know what? He might have ended up being a guy like Bill Maher, where he's technically a liberal but would have been shunned because he doesn't line up with everything perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think he would have offered a perspective on that side that like isn't really seen a lot. Like he was definitely a liberal guy. Especially on that show when you have like him versus Nick DiPaolo, you know?
Yeah.
But you know, there's something about political guys where like you look at DiPaolo is a good example, where you look at him now and you're like, oh, I just wish he didn't go down that political rabbit hole. So maybe there's something to be said for that, but that was already such a part of Giraldo's identity that I think he would have found a way to make it in the same way Jon Stewart, like, you know, Jon Stewart has come back on The Daily Show and has already done things like called out people, you know, Biden supporters and things like that for things that the left is afraid to touch on.
Well,
and you remember the clip of Jon Stewart on Colbert's show talking about the vaccine.
Oh, correct. Yeah.
So like that's what Jon Stewart was very good at, and I think Giraldo would have been very good at the same thing, which makes me think he would have done a very good podcast. And I just love playing that Dennis Leary clip also.
Oh, any excuse. But the difference between Giraldo and DiPaolo is Giraldo will make fun of everybody.
Yeah, DiPaolo digs his heels in much more on one side and gets focused on. And DiPaolo, you could argue, is funnier than Giraldo, or certainly on the same level.
Mm-hmm.
But he just gets so obsessed with one angle of things that it takes away from the brilliant comedy.
Right. And I obviously like I lean that way, so I find all of it funny. But like I can
that's the thing is it is all funny, but sometimes it gets exhausting when you know where he's coming from. Whereas
Right.
Giraldo and other guys we're going to talk about, you don't necessarily know where they're coming from.
Right. Number 4 on the list, Bill Hicks.
Yeah, I mean, this feels like an obvious choice. Again, another guy that may have been more of an angry old crank later in his life. But like we said in the Bill Hicks episode, I think Bill Hicks would have just had Bill Maher's career, basically. Bill Maher, I think, has the career that he does because Bill Hicks died, essentially. Like, I think Bill Hicks just would have been a better version of that. Now, you could also argue, I know Bill Maher did a show called Politically Incorrect and everything, but Bill Hicks might have been a guy who legitimately couldn't have those opportunities because of how politically incorrect he was willing to be. Like we, you know, heard him call out Jay Leno for doing commercials and things like that. And while I think Jay Leno has a good and interesting perspective on it, I do think that might have gotten in the way of Bill Hicks's ability to succeed, where maybe he was a guy that's so railed against you know, the industry and things like that it would have cost him opportunities, which is why a podcast would have been perfect for him because he wouldn't need anybody. You know, he could just put it out on his own.
So anyway, I was censored from the show, and I kind of think there's a little pride in that. I mean, a lot of people have been bleeped and burped, and but actually what happened was I did some material about pro-life people. Mm-hmm. And the joke I did was very simple. All I said was, if you're so pro-life, do me a favor, don't lock arms and block medical clinics. Lock arms and block cemeteries. Let's see how committed you are to this premise. It could even be construed as pro-life if you wanted to make that argument. Yeah. Anyway, they counted that as one of the quote-unquote hot points that I touched on. Here's the punchline. Monday night during the Letterman show, a commercial airs for pro-life. So see, we just had a misunderstanding. I thought I lived in the U.S. of A., United States of America. Right. And actually we live in the U.S. of A., United States of advertising. Freedom of expression is guaranteed if you've got the money. Okay.
And he's making points that might now seem almost like cliche, like things people have said over and over again. But that's, I think, the mark of why he was like a generational voice, is he was saying them 10, 15 years before it was a mainstream talking point, maybe even 20 years, you know? So that's why I think Hicks would have been great. I think he also had potential to have kind of a Marin type of career where you forget he died when he was like 32 or something. He was very young when he died. So he had potential to have a Maron type podcast in the sense that he could have been rehabilitating a lot of his relationships and been like, yeah, I know I was an asshole 30 years ago because he does seem like that kind of gruff personality that was probably a dick to a lot of young comics. And you can just hear a lot of Hicks in Maron. So I think that could have lent itself to an interesting. Now, like I said, if he focused on politics, maybe he would have sounded like an old crank later in life. But I think voices like that are always ahead of the curve are typically always evolving, Like you heard it with Carlin late in life. He was less funny, but he was maybe more interesting in the sense that he was always at the forefront of where society was going, it felt like.
Yep. And next, kind of someone who's like always, I feel like I always hear these two in the same sentence is George Carlin.
Well, yeah. So in fact, he was just in the same sentence a moment ago with me. So
that's true.
So I mean, Carlin feels like an obvious choice. Now, the reason I didn't put Dave Chappelle on this list is because I feel like he's able to get it all out there now. Like, essentially, he just does a podcast and calls it a comedy special and releases it on Netflix.
He also did a podcast that was behind a paywall that I don't think anyone listened to.
Yeah, I did.
Oh, no.
And it was weird. I was kind of excited because I was like, oh, it's going to be Dave Chappelle doing a podcast, but it wasn't. It was like there was a lot of music involved, and
yeah,
Talib Kweli was on, who's nuts, and like, I don't know. It was.
You guys have a checkered past.
It wasn't for me. But Carlin, because he didn't come up in the generation where he could just talk as much as he wanted, it was kind of relegated to the stage and the few, media appearances he was able to do. I do think having more Carlin would have been interesting, and kind of like I said about Hicks and Giraldo, you don't know where he was going to go. Now, for the same reason I didn't include Lenny Bruce on the list, maybe Carlin would have been just another one in the sea of podcasts that are taking on social issues. But like I said, I think he was such a unique mind, similar to another guy later on our list, that I don't think you can predict what he would have said about, the times that we're in, what he would have said about the pandemic or Trump or anything like that. I don't think you could predict how Carlin would have thought about those things, which you can't say about a lot of people.
Now, there's one thing you might have noticed I don't complain about. Politicians. Everybody complains about politicians. Everybody says they suck. Yeah! Well, where do people think these politicians come from? They don't fall out of the sky. They don't pass through a membrane from another reality. They come from American parents and American families, American homes, American schools, American churches, American businesses, and American universities, and they're elected by American citizens. This is the best we can do, folks. This is what we have to offer. It's what our system produces. Garbage in, garbage out. If you have selfish, ignorant citizens, you're going to get selfish, ignorant leaders. And term limits ain't going to do you any good. You're just going to wind up with a brand new bunch of selfish, ignorant Americans. So maybe it's not the politicians who suck. Maybe something else sucks around here, like the public. Yeah, the public sucks. There's a nice campaign slogan for somebody. The public sucks. Fuck hope. Fuck hope.
He just has such a beautiful perspective that you don't get to hear everywhere anymore. And like I said, there are places you can hear people essentially ripping off Carlin, but like he was at the forefront of that, which means he would have evolved over time. And also, I do think if he had an outlet like a podcast, if that was available to him, I think maybe towards the end on stage, you would have gotten more silly Carlin because he would have had an outlet for all the serious stuff, I think that's an important thing too, where like he felt he had to get these messages out there, but there was some silly shit early on in Carlin that was funny that he just kind of abandoned later in his career, where he's just rhyming and listing things and ranting about the government.
I find it funny that he's like, fuck hope, like use that as a slogan, and Obama's slogan was hope. So I wonder if he like did that on purpose.
I don't know when this came out, but I don't think so. He died in like 2008, so I doubt it. But
Oh no, I know, but I don't know if Obama. No, I mean, did Obama hear that and go like, "Oh, this would be funny"?
That'd be hilarious. I doubt it, but that'd be hilarious.
That's what I mean. I'm giving him credit here. I know that's not what you expected me to say. Next on our list, this would have been great. Joan Rivers.
We talked about Joan recently. It's actually funny because we've played some of the clips we've played are from prior episodes, and I announced we're taking a break from the free episodes for a little while. So this feels like an old TV best of where I'm like, boy, Craig, we sure have had a lot of crazy guest stars drop by here on Why You Laughing.
Yeah.
But yes, we did do a Joan Rivers episode a few weeks ago, and we talked about this, how she would have been a great podcaster because she's just such a shit talker and unapologetic, and she loved it. Like, I think she really loved going on Howard Stern and calling people out. So this is a clip we didn't get to play a few weeks ago, her talking about Lisa Lampanelli.
Umbrella. Do you get jealous of female comics, particularly female comics who, like, you kind of see, like Lisa Lampanelli right now is very hot, right?
Well, to a point. How many black I fucked him jokes can you do?
So you're not.
No, she's a one-note comic. She's fine, but she's not. Here we go. She's fine.
Why are you being diplomatic?
Because she's going to come.
Hold on. You know what's hilarious?
Very nice.
And this is maybe Howard's perspective from doing radio. She came out and said, I mean, to a point, how many black guy jokes can you do? She's very one note. And Howard goes, why are you being diplomatic?
Well, he can tell that she's holding back.
Yeah, he knows this is Joan restraining herself and being political.
Girl.
No, but I'm
I
saying,
don't think
like
she's
some
one
people
note.
say Lisa Lampanelli is the new Joan Rivers. You know, they're always
No
looking for
way.
the new Joan Rivers. But you feel she has not earned that title.
No. She's very good on a certain level.
Right.
And Joan Rivers, we don't need a new one. We got one.
And I think
I will say, boy, did she turn out to be correct. Where the fuck did she go?
Oh, I mean, well, that's the other thing is like Joan was correct, and we heard her talking about Chelsea Handler. It's like, where's Chelsea Handler been? I think Joan knew, like, there's a shelf life on basically imitating me. You know, you got to find a second layer.
Right.
I think this sounds terrible. I think I'm unique. I think I'm very lucky.
Well, you are unique.
And I think I'm the best stand-up alive today. How about
but
that?
you're not gracious, let's say,
I'm
to
not
like
gracious.
Lisa. Right. You're like, I don't need to be gracious to Lisa. Like, you don't feel like, hey, look what I've created. I've created a job for a lot of women.
Are you gracious?
I'm not gracious.
That's a
I'm
great
fighting
question.
for where I love what I do. I do it great, and I get out of my way.
How so if you see Lisa Lampanelli, do you go up to her and say, "Oh, you're doing fine," but
Yeah.
you don't embrace her?
I'm doing. She started with me one time.
She did
about something. I thought first of all I didn't even know who she was.
Right.
So then they said, "Well, Lisa Lampanelli said, oh, they didn't use her on the comedy special, my comedy thing." So she started doing a lot. And I kept saying, "Who is she?"
Right.
You know. And then I saw her stuff. And every time you see her, it's still, I fucked a black guy, got a black guy, need a fucking black guy. Okay, let's get a second story in here.
You fucking.
She's so disgusted. But yeah, like, I think you pointed out her question back to Howard. She's a good conversationalist and furthering the conversation. She seems to be very good at that. I mean, the amount of time she's called out different celebrities over the years, that became her job on E, essentially. She was never afraid to do that. And I think she would have been a great shit talker in this, like, she would have had the type of podcast where every few months a Joan clip goes viral because she's shitting on someone. And it would be something she forgot she even said, you know, like just kind of in passing. But to us, it would have been great, just juicy gossip, you know?
Yeah.
And Joan's another great example of, and I tried to articulate this in the Joan Rivers episode. I don't know that I did a great job, but basically what I was saying, Joan's massively famous, of course, but I think really would have found her audience and a bigger audience because she kind of had this, like, there was an idea that, like, Joan was for the girls because she would talk about fashion and things like that. I think she would have found a bigger male audience with a podcast because she'd be just dumping on people, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah, she's a great talker that I think would have found an even bigger audience if she was in, you know, around in the real era of podcasting.
I think she would basically be like Call Her Daddy Huge at their peak, but consistently, I think.
But yeah, and I think more genuine than Call Her Daddy. Like Call Her Daddy, it felt full where it's like, we get it, you're talking about blowjobs. I think Joan really could have provided something like that would have been interesting in her actual voice.
Yeah, she would also had guests on them, called them pigs or something. Like it would.
Yeah, Joan wouldn't have gone through the era where she's wearing pantsuits and laughing with major celebrities. You know.
Right. Next, number 9 or 2, however we're counting this, Louis C.K.
Yeah, number 2. Why is that difficult?
Well, depending on which way we count from.
Who would do it the opposite way?
I don't fucking know if this is in particular order.
So Louis C.K. technically, like Colin Quinn, I forgot to mention this. Colin Quinn technically had the Bob Kelly and sometimes Colin Quinn show. It was one of the first podcasts ever recorded. But I just don't count it really because it wasn't very sustained for very long. Louis C.K. had a podcast that I don't know how many people listened to it, but it was during the pandemic. It was 10 episodes. It was him and his girlfriend. It was called like Long Distance Relationship or something like that. It was him and his girlfriend from France, and it was these conversations they would have. And Louis C.K., you forget because of how famous he got, you forget that he was a great Opie and Anthony guest.
Great.
Like we played the "Are You a Lizard Person" clip,
Mhm.
one of the most famous, and him and Patrice O'Neal, the famous joke that I can't repeat, where the N-word came from.
Right.
But like stuff like that, like Louis was a tremendous. He's forgotten almost because he became so big. Like I think if you think Opie and Anthony guest, you think obviously Patrice and Voss and Colin and Bobby, and even you think of Burr maybe sometimes, but you almost forget that Louis was in that group, and he was a great radio guest. But he's also like, he has this great dynamic of knowledge and silliness. Like he is well versed in a lot of different topics, but also can maintain humor to them. Unlike Rogan, I think Rogan can be funny when he wants to be funny, but when he's being serious, gets so wrapped up in the seriousness. I mean, there's compilations on YouTube you can find
Him missing jokes.
Him completely. Well, why do you think that?
Yeah.
And it's just Norman making a joke about his dad molesting him or something. He's like, "Oh, really?"
Yeah. Theo Vaughn being like, "That's just the way I tell jokes, man."
Right. It's it's wild to have Theo Vaughn and Mark Norman on your podcast and be serious with them.
Right.
But Louis has the knowledge that I think Rogan possesses on a lot of subjects, but also the complete silliness. And one of the great trilogies. No, I think it maybe 4-part episode. I forget how long it was.
I think it was 4.
Yeah, the Presidents on Matt and Shane is one of the great arcs in podcasting history, and it perfectly summarizes what I'm talking about, where their knowledge on the subject is much more than a lot of podcasts would have, but they also keep it silly and very funny, and this is an example of that.
So it was part of the reason that all of it, including Sally Hemings, that his loves were all secret because he was ashamed of every woman that he loved after that.
That's hot.
And so there was a woman in Paris. She was a British painter, and her husband, she was a woman, she was married, but she was a painter, and she fell in love with Thomas Jefferson, and they were very much in love with each other. But then the way they broke up was very funny to me because he wrote her these beautiful letters. She was in love with him. He was in love with her. But then the French, when he was leaving France, they wanted a great portrait of him to put in the National Gallery. And they said to him, "You can choose any painter in the world." And he was like, "No, I want, a real guy." His girlfriend was like, "Why not me?" And he's like, "Baby, come on. I mean,
You're good.
You're good, but you're not like fucking grown man good. You're not like fucking, I'm not for history."
See, I think Colin Quinn and Louis doing a show together would be great because he leans left and I think Colin leans a little right.
Oh my God, would that have been beautiful? Yeah.
Yeah.
Or honestly, maybe I'm wrong here. Louis and DePaulo would have been a great podcast, I think.
Yeah, well, they're also super good friends. So
Right, that's what I mean. Is like I think they could have gotten past a lot of the political horse shit. So I think they would have been great. But yeah, I would have listened to that as a podcast, a history podcast with Matt, Shane, and Louis. And Matt's only in one of the episodes. I think it's just Shane and Louis for the other three. Those two. Shane is good as the.
There's one where they're all three of them are there, and Shane goes to do ads, and Louis just crushes him.
Well, yeah, they're very well versed in the subjects that they're talking about. Like they're knowledgeable about certain areas of history and everything. And you hear right there where Louis knows very well the story that he's talking about, but also tells it like a comedian would.
Mm-hmm.
The example I always use is what like drunk history should have been. You know what I mean? Where the idea of drunk history is it's like these drunk people telling a story and that's supposed to be hilarious. To me, just these guys like Shane Gillis's delivery or Louis C.K.'s delivery, that guy basically giving you a history lesson, but a completely unconventional history teacher. And you know, Colin Quinn, you're right, is a good example because I always love the DeRosa line at the Rich Voss roast where DeRosa says, when did Colin Quinn become the substitute teacher that wants to make learning fun? But that is what he did in a lot of those one-man shows. And yeah, Colin and Louis would have been a great like history podcast. That would have been tremendous.
Yeah.
So something like that for Louis, if he found that, I think it would have been really good. Because, and you know, you've pointed out when we've talked about Louis in the past, when he started taking himself too seriously and like emailed everyone about how Hillary Clinton's a great mother and you should vote for her.
Ugh.
You know, his ultimate, I think the ultimate failing there was putting his words in print.
Yeah.
Where you don't have that. Whereas if you hear him talk about a subject, I think he can talk about things and put it in a much sillier nature. Now, in a way, maybe him getting canceled helped him kind of steer off the path of getting too serious.
For sure, because everything he promoted crushed him to death.
Right.
But he did go on a late night show in a 3-piece suit and do.
He started wearing suits on his specials too, and you started seeing him wear the glasses more and being a little more serious Louis. So I think we avoided that, luckily. You know, unluckily for him, but for the fans, I guess. But yeah, I think Louis could have done a tremendous podcast. Now, he's not always the greatest podcast guest. Like I said, I think in one of his Rogan appearances at least, he gets a little too bogged down in seriousness. But you're right. If he was paired with someone like Colin or Shane, that like they could just riff on history like that, I think that would have been tremendous. So that's why Louis is number 2 for me.
It would be Colin for like a history, Nick for like current events.
Yeah. I like that.
The perfect.
Let's set that up. All those guys are alive. Let's make it happen.
Let's make it happen, guys. But number 1, it shouldn't surprise anybody.
If you know this, if you know why we titled this podcast the way we did, anything, you know who number 1 is. It felt I almost didn't do it because it just felt too obvious.
Every episode we're like, oh, imagine.
Of course, number 1 is Patrice O'Neal because, I mean, of course it is. Like he would have had the number 1 podcast today. Like I genuinely believe that, or maybe not number 1 because it would have turned some people off, I think. But like critically, I think he would have had one of, if not the best podcast. So let's, what clip do we have for him?
Him talking about setting up with Jay Moore.
This is devastating. I mean, this is sad. You know, this reminds me of like corny movies. Like, did you ever see Notorious, the Biggie Smalls movie?
A long time ago.
This to me is like one of the best examples of it, where there's literally a scene at the end of the movie where the guy playing Chris Wallace says, I'm not going to do the impression, but he says, he goes, you know what? I think I finally got it all figured out.
Yeah, exactly.
And he walks outside and gets shot. They're like, wow, Biggie Smalls really would have turned his life around. He would have stopped with the drugs and fucking around, and he would have raised his child. But unfortunately, he was murdered. But we have evidence that that's essentially what happened to Patrice O'Neal.
It hurts. This was like a couple weeks before, wasn't it?
Yes, before he had a stroke, yeah. So he does the Charlie Sheen roast in September of 2011. He had a stroke in October of 2011, where he slipped into a diabetic coma. He died at the end of November 2011. In between that time, somewhere between September and October, he did More Stories with Jay Moore, which at the time was one of the biggest podcasts in 2011. And throughout the whole thing, Jay Moore does come off a bit of a douche at times. Like, there's moments where you roll your eyes, but ultimately his message was like, Patrice, you think people are like disrespecting you or hate you? They're jealous of you. You're one of the funniest guys ever. And Patrice is talking about not wanting to do the roasts because he feels like he gets a weird reaction. He's like, people are, Jay Moore tells him, like, people are marveling because they can't do what you just did.
Perfect.
And so he's convincing him. He's like, you got to do more roasts. You got to do a podcast. You'd be great at it. And Patrice is kind of like looking at he's like, well, how much is this equipment? And you go back and listen to the whole episode if you haven't, because it tugs at your heartstrings because you're like, fuck, we just missed out.
I'll tell you this right now.
Break it.
If I end up with a podcast, if I have a podcast, it's gonna be not that you wanted this, but I'm gonna say this. It will be directly attributed to Jay Moore. Good. And I'll say why.
No, once you stand up, you're out, motherfucker.
Yeah, but I'm gonna say why.
He stood up at the table.
I'm on, I think, one end of the spectrum. There's a middle, and I think you're on the other end of the spectrum in terms of you have a lot of philosophy on why to do it. I have a lot of philosophy on why not to do it in things in general. So what you're saying, your conviction on why to do it is interesting. And not just a podcast, just anything. Where you go, why not do that? Because my idea is, why do another roast? I did well on this one. Why bother to do the next thing that I really don't want to do anyway? But you have an interesting scope on why to do it.
You have to do the.
Yeah, so you hear him there kind of realizing, and who knows, maybe it's like when you want to start a diet and every night you go, all right, tomorrow the diet starts.
Yep.
So maybe there could have been some of that where Patrice is saying this now and then tomorrow just reverts back to how he was.
But like you said, though, when he's going like, how much does this cost? How much is that? You're like, oh, no, he's in.
Yeah, he was looking at, now, I mean, Black Phillip, a lot of people probably consider like his podcast.
It was a weird radio show.
But yeah, I think with more freedom to just do whatever he wanted and more time to kind of sink into it, I think he would have really had a great podcast. And like I said, he would have offered perspectives, like we said about some of these other guys, but Patrice really, to where people still listen to his old stuff and quote a lot of his takes. Now, would he have had some pushback on some of his thoughts about women? Perhaps.
Or maybe he kept that so mainstream that it never became a thing.
Would he have been allowed to have a podcast based on some of his thoughts on women? Who knows?
We would have had it would have been good on all counts because he would be currently doing a show with Anthony and reeling him in the fuck in.
Well, that's the thing about Patrice is like we can't predict what he would have been doing because even some of his thoughts on women, you hear him kind of change those over the years and evolve them. Like, I think Patrice was such a thoughtful guy and constantly thinking of why things were the way they were. Like, these were constantly on his mind so much that they would be well-crafted thoughts and change with the times and things and not be exactly what we expect them to be. So I think that in part is why Patrice would have had a great podcast. He was never afraid of confrontation. Like, if you go back and listen to some of his Opie and Anthony appearances, to me, the one that stands out, maybe we'll do this as one of our first bonus episodes during the break, because I'm thinking of it now. But his fight with Danny Ross, where Patrice literally forecasts what's to come for Danny Ross's life. It speaks so much to his insight and his ability to run into confrontation instead of away from it. Like, that's why you wish Patrice was here for a lot of the moments that have happened over the last 13 years or so. So Patrice, obviously the biggest loss, the guy that should have had a podcast because he was right on the brink of it. And even if we didn't hear that conversation with Jay Moore, you just know over the next few years, like, that's what Patrice would have been doing. It suited him best. Now, the real tough thing is, like, maybe he would have done one of more. Maybe he would have been on the Alec Baldwin roast or something.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? Like that,
Yeah.
we missed out on that too, because I think those would have really skyrocketed him. But maybe it would have been the Brady roast. Who knows? That would have been something.
Maybe he would have hosted.
Not enough. Well, if only.
I didn't think Kevin Hart was that bad, but
A little weird. But hey, Patrice is a Boston guy too, so it would have been fitting.
that's true.
It is Patrice. The most interesting thing to think of is like, because he died, we're all able to say, oh, he would have been the biggest comic ever. But like, would society have allowed him to be? He would have been the funniest. But would he have been like? Would we have allowed him to succeed in our horseshit society, or is it just convenient for people to say like, "Oh, I love Patrice"?
Well,
you know?
his benefit for him is he's not a white guy.
That's true. Yeah, he would have gotten away with a little more. But look at Chappelle, you know,
Yeah, I mean,
who is, and as I say that, he's one of the biggest comics ever. So
I was gonna say, like, I don't think it really affected him. He
It
was just
didn't.
like, all right.
it didn't. Yeah. So yeah, Patrice obviously number one. Now, when we said you probably know who number one is, maybe you thought of a different name. I don't know if I consider this a podcast or not. Do you?
So it used to be out on Apple and stuff, but now
It was released as a podcast. I think of it as my favorite talk show ever. But Norm Macdonald Live, you could also consider a great podcast. So that's why I had a hard time putting it on the list. But I figured at least honorable mention Norm Macdonald, because Norm Macdonald Live is one of my favorite shows. And if you consider it a podcast, then he had a tremendous podcast. If you don't consider it a podcast, then you threw me off. I forgot what I was going to say. What?
I was going to say you can look at it in two ways. Either a perfect example of all of these potentially working out. See, like Norm, you know what I mean?
Yeah. I'm glad you interrupted me to say kind of what I was getting to.
I thought I was helping you finish your thought. That's all.
I was in the middle of it.
I know. I thought you were ending. So
Ending. I'm helping you finish your thought.
That's what I thought.
All right. Anyways, let's hear some clips from Norm Macdonald Live.
What's your dream view?
Hold on. All right. By the way, a hilarious question by Kevin Nealon. The fantasy team of view guests. What's your dream view?
What's your dream view?
You mean the show, The View?
Yeah.
The
Who would
guest?
you, what 4 or 5 ladies would you want on there?
Ooh, that's a great question. Susan Yeagley. That's your wife. He doesn't even recognize her name. It's your betrothed.
Betrothed.
Like, just his little reactions to everything, where Kevin Nealon was just letting him finish. He's like, yeah, no, obviously he knows his wife's name. And Norm was expecting a big reaction from him. Like, hey.
It's funny because you can tell like who's friends with him, because he's just like, this is Norm. I'm just gonna let him go.
That's your wife. And Adam Egget, by the way, was so great on that show.
Oh, unreal.
Where you hear him there go like, what a great question.
So that would be a good short episode too. Is just Adam Egget on Norm Macdonald Live.
In that same the Rogan clip I was talking about earlier, where they were talking about getting Norm on Rogan, Colin Quinn talked about Adam Egget at Norm's funeral, and he said Adam Egget crushed because he just walked up and said, if you Google my name, if you start to type in my name on Google, the first thing that comes up is Adam Egget, Holocaust denier. And that is how much I loved this man.
He's unbelievable.
But yeah, the chemistry between those two on that show, like I said, not a traditional podcast, but that's what you want from Norm. So I guess in a way you should consider it a podcast, because that's the type of podcast Norm would have done.
Yeah.
Where he does make it a little different. And that's like what I expected when we talked about Andy Kaufman, is like, it's a podcast, but also not really. You're not sure if you consider it a podcast. That's where I think Norm Macdonald Live stands to me. So it is the perfect Norm podcast, but we have a couple more clips, right?
Yeah. Also, you were talking about it being like your favorite late night show or whatever.
Yeah.
Or talk show. Just the fact that when they do the jokes at the end, you know he wrote them all. Is
yes.
Also,
well, because he was, someone would be like, "Who wrote this?" And he's like, we have a whole, we have a whole team.
Here he is with Letterman.
And I know you were on a TV program. And then when she was your guest, there was this incredible chemistry. And was there ever anything romantic with her? I mean, she must have been very desirable to you. You ever lay down on top of her, I guess. I don't know.
Now, wait a minute. You bring up a good point, Norm. The first one of the day.
Now you have a show.
I think so. Norm was actually like, I think, a great interviewer in a way. Like I thought he was very good, particularly at making his guests comfortable. But when he asked a question that like fell flat or didn't get a great reaction or whatever, he was the best at saving it like that.
Mhm.
Like he sees Letterman not like eager to answer necessarily, so he goes, "I guess did you lie down on top of her?" Is what I'm saying. He could pull himself out with a hilarious line.
I think Letterman sleeping with people while at that show is like a problem topic. For
I know, which is why which is hilarious that Norm would bring it up to his idol. But like, there's so many great moments like that. Like, a classic one is him and Nick Swartzen. He has Nick Swartzen on, and the name Nikki Cox came up for some reason, and Swartzen goes, "Oh yeah, she's married to Jay Moore," and Norm Macdonald goes, "She's married to Jay Moore, but when I met her, she was married to Bobcat Goldthwait." And Swartzen kind of just nods, and there's like a silence for a second, and Norm goes, "I'm not a skilled interviewer, let's face it." Like he just had nothing and just throws out, "I'm not a skilled interviewer," which is what made him a great interviewer, I think.
Here's our last clip here.
Okay.
Yeah, he's a half a Jew and a half a self-hating Jew.
That's called anti-Semite.
An anti-Semite, yeah. He's a half a proud Jew and half a virulent anti-Semite. He's conflicted. He's a virulent anti-Semite. That's come out on the show.
That's come out on the show.
Adam Riga is the best punching bag that's ever existed.
It's that I'm Not Norm Macdonald channel edits it great too, because it shows Norm Macdonald saying it and then in a different interview saying that's come out on the show as if like it spilled out somehow.
Virulent? Well, he's a Holocaust denier. Oh. You know, you're very good friends with David Irving, the author, who he reads constantly.
Yeah, I'm not friends with David Irving.
Do you know that he, though, is a revisionist?
Oh, you're a revisionist?
Well, he's a denier, Holocaust denier. You've never met David Irving because he said he's too smart. And I tell him, well, David Irving would be your biggest ally, you know what I mean, instead of these morons. You knew David Irving instantly when I said it, as if you're his best friend. He's Jewish.
Are you Jewish?
Yeah.
Okay, then you'll get it.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Half Jewish. No, I'm full Jewish.
Full Jewish. All right, then. But you're young, so you might not get it.
Maybe.
Okay, so here's the joke.
Holocaust denier. I'm also.
You just broke
I'm not
Jerry.
Hold that against you.
I actually considered putting Jerry on the list, to be honest with you.
Oh, he'd actually. Well, yeah, comedians in cars. I guess that wouldn't count. But
That's what was my. I was like, comedians in cars getting coffee is essentially a podcast. But that's what made me think he would have been great at it. But the reason I didn't is because it would be so hyper focused on comedy.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think there's enough of that. Like these to me were kind of podcasts we missed out on having. Whereas I think a guy talking comedy the way Jerry would, I think there's been plenty of that over the years, you know?
I would listen to it. That's for sure.
Oh, I definitely listen. I think like for all of the things that annoy me about Jerry, I do find him to be a great podcast guy. He's a fascinating guy to listen to. And even like I thought his speech about free speech or privilege rather. The speech that he gave at Duke about privilege. I thought that was very well done. And I thought his statement on like sitcoms now, people gave him a lot of shit for that, and they're like, You're so vanilla and like you're a clean comic. How dare you speak out for this? And it's like, oh no, Jerry's a very wise comic. And you should want guys like him speaking out for that, because he's saying, hey, I'm not a part of this. This doesn't affect me, and I can see the negative that it's doing.
Right.
I'm not being selfish in my thought. I'm an outside observer telling you what's happening. So I think Jerry could have easily been on this list. I didn't include him. But you guys let me know who else. But yeah, the Holocaust denier and jerking off punks for $15 a man. are two of my favorite bits on any podcast. And it's what makes Adam Egget, like you said, the best punching bag there is, because he knew exactly how to play along with it and kind of be the sad sack on the show.
That too, but it's also it sucks when that happens, but and what's being said is so fucking funny because you have nothing to say to it.
Yeah. Well, there's even like sometimes the guests that knew Norm well enough, like Bob Einstein and David Spade, like knew perfectly how to play along with it.
Mm-hmm.
Because I didn't realize when I first watched the show, I was like, oh, David Spade's meeting Adam Egget for the first time. I didn't realize they'd probably known each other forever.
Yeah.
Because there's a line where Norm introduces him and goes, Adam Egget. And David Spade goes, that's your name? Ugh, you should change it. And I found that line so funny. And then like when I found out, oh, they've probably known each other for a long time. I was like, that's so well delivered by David Spade.
Improv background.
Yeah. Tempe Improv, yeah.
That's right.
All right. So I hope we nailed it. I hope you guys enjoyed this as a topic, because I think I do like these hypothetical episodes. I think it's kind of fun to think about because it's a way to talk about different eras of comedy.
Mm-hmm.
And also just bullshit about the current times as well, you know?
Comment anyone you think we missed.
Yeah. And I do think, like I said, I like this. Maybe we could do like best comics that never had a sitcom or a TV show or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
That could be a fun episode. So any ideas like that you have, and any you think we missed, sound off in the comments. Particularly if you're on YouTube. If you like, comment, subscribe, all that helps us get more eyes on this thing. Go back through the archives, like all the episodes, comment on all of them. Let us know your thoughts and feedback and all of that, and make sure you subscribe to the channel. And also tap the notification bell, because when we do drop a new Why You Laughing in a few weeks, you're going to want to be aware of that. So, tap the notification bell. Make sure you get all updates on the Blind Mike Project and Why You Laughing. And subscribe everywhere. If you want those bonus episodes and the episodes that are going to come out in the future, if you want them early, then become a member for as little as $5 a month on YouTube or Patreon. Consider subscribing. We appreciate it. And like I said, during the if you don't subscribe to Patreon or YouTube, then consider checking out the Blind Mike Project, because we might do extra episodes of those while we work on future episodes of Why You Laughing. So make sure you do all that. We appreciate it. It supports this show. Support Craig, verygoodshow.org. If you thought his interruption was the key part of this episode, then listen to him where he's free and clear on Very Good Show. He's the boss there.
Yeah, that's right.
He gets to run the whole shebang. You can hear Matt interrupt him on
That's
Very
right.
Good Show.
Yeah.
So support Craig, verygoodshow.org. You can check out Rubbed Out and Very Good Show. And, to those of you that are members, that are gearheads on Patreon and YouTube, we'll talk to you soon. And for the rest of you, consider subscribing. And if not, we'll talk to you in a few weeks on Why Are You Laughing?
Zip it up and zip it out.